should COVID vaccines be made compulsory in Israel, would a person who refuses to be vaccinated be halachically justified in leaving the land of Israel?
First of all, I should state for the record that I have in fact been asked just such a question, and I can state further that I am aware of at least one family that has more or less decided to emigrate to the United States, at least temporarily, due to COVID-related restrictions, regulations, and the possibility of enforced vaccinations here in Israel. So this is a very real and practical question and a very real concern. We find in the Talmud Bavli, Masechet Ketubot, Kof Yod Amud Beth, the following Baraitha. Tana Rabbanan, our sages taught, Le'odam yadur adam ba'aretz Yisrael. A person should always opt and choose and endeavor to live in Eretz Yisrael. Afilu be'ir sheruba goyim, even in a city, a town, which is populated mainly by non-Jews. And this means, in practical terms, that he and his family, his children, will be surrounded by non-Jewish and idolatrous culture. In those days, all Gentiles were idolatrous, worshippers of various forms of Avodah Zarah. With all of this implies and entails, this could also have a very real impact on the Jewish education that a person might be able to provide for his children. And these are very real concerns. And yet, the Chachamim state that a person should always endeavor and strive to live in Eretz Yisrael despite, and even in such circumstances, afilu be'ir sheruba goyim, wa'al yadur b'chutz la'aretz, rather than living in chutz la'aretz, outside the land of Israel, wa'afilu be'ir sheruba Yisrael, even in a city, in a town, in a place which is mainly inhabited by Jews. And the intention here is Torah observant Jews, with all that implies. Again, a Jewish community, an active shul, synagogue, Jewish education, not being surrounded by negative influences at every step and turn. The Baraitha goes on to state, Shekol hadar ba'eretz Yisrael doma kami sheyesh lo Eloha, because a person who dwells in the land of Israel has a direct and clear connection to Hashem. Such a person is connected to Hashem. And a person who lives in Chutz La'aretz is as if he does not have such a connection and does not have Hashem in that same central position in his life as a Jew in Eretz Yisrael. And on the following page, Kof Yod Aleph, Amud Aleph 111a, we find Amar Rabbi al-Azar, Kol Hadar Ba'aretz Yisrael, he who dwells in the land of Israel, Sharui B'lo Awon, is without sin. In other words, the actual dwelling in Eretz Yisrael has this spiritual effect and outcome, that it melts away one's sins and causes one to be viewed and considered to be on a higher level. And just as the Hachamim stressed the centrality of Eretz Yisrael in the Torah as a whole, and emphasized the importance of a Jew dwelling in practice in Eretz Yisrael, no matter what the conditions, similarly, the Chachamim stressed that it is forbidden to emigrate for a Jew who lives in Eretz Yisrael, who resides in Eretz Yisrael, to move away, to leave Eretz Yisrael on a permanent or semi-permanent basis. Even in the case where this would involve performing a mitzvah. In other words, the reason for leaving Eretz Yisrael would be to perform a mitzvah, as we see in the following ma'aseh, the following story that is related here in the Talmud. Hahu gavara لنفلا ليفما بحساء. There was a Jew in Eretz Yisrael. He had a brother who had emigrated to Bavel, to Babylon. There he had married a Jewish woman, and this brother had died without children. Thus the widow is now Yevama, and this Jew living in Eretz Yisrael, the brother, has the obligation to perform the mitzvah of Yibum, to marry this woman, or if he refuses to do so, to perform and agree to a certain ceremony in the Beth Din and give her a get, a bill of divorce. But the essential mitzvah is to marry this woman and to raise up a child, raise up seed in his brother's name. So such a Jew living in Eretz Yisrael turned to Rabbi Hanina and asked him, Mahu lemehath uliyabama? Is it correct, is it proper, according to halacha, that I leave Eretz Yisrael, move to Bavel, in order to perform the mitzvah of Yibum with my brother's widow? In other words, he knew that there is a problem with emigrating from Eretz Yisrael. He also knew that in this case he would not simply be able to travel there for a few days, for a week, perform the mitzvah and return to Eretz Yisrael. This would involve almost certainly living in Bavel, settling there, at least for a significant period of time. Rabbi Hanina responded and said, Amar le, ahiu nasa goya. He paraphrased, as it were, his response by saying, that person's brother married literally a non-Jewish woman. Now, of course, this is not the case. We're not talking about a non-Jewish woman. If that were the case, then there would be no mitzvah of Yibum, and this discussion would never have taken place. What he meant to say was, this person left Eretz Yisrael, this, in other words, your brother, but he didn't want to say that. He said, that person left Eretz Yisrael and married a Jewish woman in Chutz La'aretz, in Bavel, in a country outside Eretz Yisrael. And that should be considered almost as bad as marrying a non-Jewish woman. So he said, Amar le ahiu nasak goya. That man's brother married a non-Jewish woman, umeth, and died. And Rabbi Hanina was saying, what happened to this person was a punishment for what he did. Baruch hamakom sheharago. Blessed be Hashem who killed him. That is the response, a very sharp, but nevertheless entirely intellectually honest response. I suggest that for one moment, and I add this parenthetically, of course, that you consider for a moment how many rabbis today would be willing to respond to a Jew, to one of their congregants perhaps, who comes to him with such a question. But Rabbi Hanina did not mince his words, and he spoke his mind. And he said, that person left Eretz Yisrael, he did a terrible thing, and he was punished for it. And that man, in other words, you, should follow in his footsteps and leave as well. That was his response. And of course the Jew understood and got the message. And we find something similar in the Talmud Yerushalmi, Masechet Moed Katan, at the beginning of the 3rd chapter. Had Kohen, a certain Kohen, Athal Rabbi Hanina, the same Rabbi Hanina. This Jew who was a Kohen came to Rabbi Hanina and said, Mahu laseth l'sor la'asot devar miswa. Is it permitted for me to go to Thor? Thor is the city on the coast of what is referred to today as Lebanon, which is of course part of Eretz Yisrael as well, but it was considered halachically, for halachic purposes at that time, was considered to be outside the land of Israel. And when he said to perform a mitzvah, he meant, and he explained himself, la haloth or liyabem, to perform either the ceremony of halitha, again a similar question, or liyabem, or to perform the mitzvah of yibum for my brother's widow who had no, and he died without children. I should explain here that in addition to the halakha against emigrating from Eretz Yisrael, in the case of someone who resides in Eretz Yisrael. For any Jew, in the case of a Kohen, there was an added prohibition at that time for a Kohen who lived in Eretz Yisrael to move to Chutz La'aretz, to emigrate, because Eretz Yisrael was considered to be tahor, to be pure, halachically pure, whereas all of Chutz La'aretz was considered to be halachically impure, tameh. So in this case, this person had a double-barreled reason or prohibition not to leave. How did Rabbi Hanina respond? Amar le, a very similar response to what we saw in the Talmud Bavli. Ahiu shel otho ha'ish yasa, the brother of that man, in other words, your brother, left the country. Baruch hamakom shenachafo, blessed be he who struck him down. Wa'at mevakesh la'asot kayosebo, and you would wish to again follow in his footsteps, to do the same action, the same sin as he himself did. That is one version of Rabbi Hanina's response, says the Yerushalmi. Another version of his response is as follows: Hachin amar le, ahiu shel otho ha'ish, that person's brother, heniach hek imo, left the bosom of his mother, wahibek hek nochriya, and embraced a foreign woman. Uvaruch shenachafo, and blessed be he who struck him down. Wa'at mevakesh la'asot kayosebo, and would you consider doing the same? Again, he didn't have to say more than that. His words were certainly powerful and even harsh, but necessarily so, in order to discourage the Jew from doing such a thing. Due to the similarity of the Ma'aseh in the Talmud Bavli, the story related in the Talmud Bavli and that related here in the Talmud Yerushalmi, it could even be that we are referring to the same case or to a very similar case, even though the place mentioned, the place in Chutz La'aretz, is not the same place. And immediately after that episode with Rabbi Hanina, we find another story with regards to the same Rabbi Hanina, Shimon Barba, a Chacham by that name, who was also a Kohen. And he found it very difficult to make a living in the Eretz Yisrael at this time. He turned to Rabbi Hanina. Amar le kethov li hada ighrad de'ikar. Please write for me a letter of recommendation, praising me as a Chacham, someone worthy of being taken by a community to be their Rav, their spiritual leader. And I will leave the country in order to find myself a livelihood in Chutz La'aretz, outside the land of Israel. Amar lo, he said to him, Lemahar ani olech esel avotecha. Tomorrow, that is to say in the future, I shall go to your forefathers, that is to say I shall die, and I will be approached by your forefathers, and they will say to me, Yehu omarim li natti'a ahath shel hamda shahayatha lanu b'Eretz Yisrael. We had in Eretz Yisrael one beautiful tree, one beautiful entity, flowering and growing in Eretz Yisrael, like a beautiful tree that someone plants in the earth. And you allowed it, you gave permission for that to be uprooted and to leave Eretz Yisrael. So Rabbi Hanina intimated to him, I will not give you such a letter of recommendation. Regarding these matters, we find in Rambam's Mishneh Torah, Hilchot Melachim u'Milhamot Perek Hamishi, the 5th chapter. At the end of the chapter, Rambam writes, Le'olam yadur adam b'Eretz Yisrael. A Jew should always endeavor and strive, do his utmost to live in Eretz Yisrael. Afilu be'ir shuruba goyim, even in a city, a town, a place which is inhabited mainly by idolatrous non-Jews. As we explained before, this has many possible consequences, not necessarily positive ones. Nevertheless, a person should strive to live in Eretz Yisrael, wa'al yadur b'chutz la'aretz, rather than living in Chutz La'aretz. Afilu be'ir shuruba Yisrael, even in a place which is inhabited mainly by Jews. where there will be a much better, more positive atmosphere and reality, more conducive to raising a Jewish family. Nevertheless, this is the halakha. He who leaves Eretz Yisrael, it is as if he is choosing to worship Avodah Zarah, to worship foreign gods. And before this, Rambam writes in Halakha Teth, Asur laset mi Eretz Yisrael husla ares le'olam. It is asur to leave Eretz Yisrael. Again, we're talking about a person who resides in Eretz Yisrael and now chooses or is considering to emigrate, to leave Eretz Yisrael permanently or for an extended period of time. We're not talking about a person who came for a visit for a day or a month or something along those lines. It is asur, it is forbidden to leave Eretz Yisrael in order to emigrate to another country outside the land of Israel. Ela lilmod Torah, except for the following reasons is it permissible. Limod Torah, to study Torah. This refers to a situation where this person knows that he will be able to study Torah under a great rabbi who is presently in Chutz La'aretz, and that no such rabbi exists at this time in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the possibility of this person growing in Torah and becoming a true Torah scholar, something that the Jewish people is always very much in need of, such a thing will not take place. This will not happen if he does not go to Chutz La'aretz for a time to study at the feet of this teacher. So to study Torah, it is mutar to leave Eretz Yisrael, or lisa isha, or in the case where a person has not been able to find an appropriate and fitting woman to marry in Eretz Yisrael, but he is aware of such a woman who is currently in Chutz La'aretz. So in order to marry and begin a family, he is allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael for a time, or lehasil miyad goyim, or to save Jews who are under attack from non-Jews in Chutz La'aretz, outside the land of Israel. V'yahazor la'aretz, but in all these cases, he must eventually return. In other words, the heter, the permission to leave Eretz Yisrael for these very valid reasons, is also only a temporary stay. It is only a hora'at sha'ah. It is only for a time, not for all time. V'chen yosehu lishora. It is also mutar to travel overseas, to leave Eretz Yisrael, even for an extended period of time, for reasons of business, commerce, trade, in order to make a living. In other words, a person wishes to live in Eretz Yisrael, but he has to survive in Eretz Yisrael. He has to make a living. And if that is how he makes his living, that is the line of work which he understands, which he is good at, in which he has succeeded in the past. But in order to do so, he may have to leave for a period of months, perhaps even a year or two. Then it is mutar to do so. Aval lishkon b'chutz la'aretz asur. However, to leave Eretz Yisrael permanently, to emigrate, this is asur if one lives in Eretz Yisrael. Ela im ken, unless hazak hara'av sham, there is famine, there is hunger in Eretz Yisrael. Quite literally, the situation is such that people are going hungry. There is a lack of food. Ad shena'asa shaweh dinar hitin mishne dinarim, to the point where the price of food, of basic staples, has doubled, so that a quantity of wheat that used to cost 1 dinar now costs 2 dinarim. When that is the case, the situation is so dire, it is not necessary and not required and not desirable that a Jew starve in Eretz Yisrael. He should obviously be able to live in Eretz Yisrael. The aim is to live, and to live as well as one can, within reason. One doesn't have to live in the lap of luxury. That is not a precondition for living in Eretz Yisrael. But nor is one required to suffer great deprivation. So when the situation is that dire, it is mutar to emigrate, to leave Eretz Yisrael, even for an extended period of time. And Rambam continues, Bameh devarim amurim, that which we just said, to which kind of situation are we referring? ושהיו המעות מצויות והפירות ביוקר. This refers to a situation where money is available, the person has money, but the cost of living has increased tremendously. As we said before, the cost of living has doubled. So the person can survive, but the situation is quite troubling. And economically the situation is very far from being satisfactory. In that situation, we said, a person may emigrate to Chutz La'aretz. However, says Rambam, Aval im hayu apirot b'zol. However, if the situation is that there is food, there is what to buy in the stores, even if it's cheap, but he has no money and does not find a way of supporting himself. In other words, the economic conditions in terms of employment and business opportunities, the situation is such that he is unable to set himself up and live in a reasonable fashion in Eretz Yisrael. And now he is in a situation where literally he is broke. He has no money to support himself. In that situation, in that kind of situation, a Jew is allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael, and if he does so, he should do so with a heavy heart, a very heavy heart. But he is allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael in order to be able to support himself. And it is correct here to point out that there have been many such periods in Jewish history, both in the distant past and in the much more recent past, that Jews, including great tzaddikim, were forced to leave Eretz Yisrael for this very reason, that the economic conditions were such that they could not really survive in Eretz Yisrael. But this, of course, is a last resort. And Rambam goes on to say, and even though in those situations that we have described, it is mutar, it is permitted to emigrate, to leave the country. And one has to admit that in those kinds of situations, even today, and even more so in ancient times, in earlier generations, when a person picked up and left, very often with his family, to another country, in order to survive economically, in order to support his family, this involved travel, settling in a new country, perhaps setting up a business or finding a job, buying a home, building a home. All of these activities imply either permanence or semi-permanence. And one never knew for a fact when one would be able to pick up and return to Eretz Yisrael. This was not a foregone conclusion. And even today it is not so, with air travel and all the tremendous differences between our times and earlier generations. Nevertheless, it is not clear when a person picks up and leaves Eretz Yisrael when he will be able to return, if at all, for all kinds of reasons. So Rambam says, Afal pisha mutar laset, even though in certain situations that we have described, it is mutar to leave. Eina midat hasidut, it is not the midah of hasidim, of the pious, of the truly righteous. In other words, even when times are very difficult, a hasid, a pious Jew who is aware and mindful of the true meaning of the Torah and the will of Hashem and the connection that a Jew has to Hashem when living in Eretz Yisrael, a Jew will avoid leaving Eretz Yisrael as much as possible, almost to the point of accepting almost any kind of situation in order to remain. This refers to the individuals mentioned at the beginning of Megillat Ruth, who left Eretz Yisrael for this very reason of famine. And they left due to great difficulties. The times were very, very trying. And yet they were judged worthy of being punished and dying early deaths, having left Eretz Yisrael. So it is not a midat hasidut. So, with regards to the question that I was asked, does the current state of affairs in Israel, the various measures and restrictions and policies that are being put in place now and in the future, including the possibility of compulsory vaccination, are these measures sufficient reason to consider leaving Eretz Yisrael? Here we need to address a question, the question that many people will be asking at this point, namely, are such concerns reasonable? Do reasonable people consider these kinds of measures, these impacts on our lives and our children's lives, to be sufficient reason to pick up and leave? To leave Israel or to leave and move to another place altogether, wherever one may live. Interestingly, just today, I heard an interview with the governor of the state of Florida in the United States, Ron DeSantis, in which he was asked about the well-known and well-documented fact, for some years now in fact, of Americans migrating from other states to the state of Florida for various reasons, due to the greater emphasis on civil liberties and freedom and other aspects of life in Florida as opposed to other states. And he responded and said that yes, it is a fact that for some time people have been moving to Florida in large numbers, picking up and leaving other states, moving their families, their businesses. And one of the reasons he mentioned for this migration having picked up over the last year with the COVID virus and the responses of various governments in different parts of the world and in the United States to the virus, one of the reasons given by some of these people moving to Florida, he says, was simply the fact that they want their children to be able to go to school. In Florida, they did not shut down schools. They had, at some point, minimal lockdowns and mask mandates, which were in fairly short order rescinded, and life was returned to normal, and schools were allowed to remain open. And he said this is how it should be, and this is how life must be conducted, and people do not want their children to have to live in some form of house arrest and be educated, or practically speaking not be educated, remotely on the computer, which does not really work, as we all know by now. And this alone, he said, caused many people to move to the state of Florida. The reason I mention this is to point out that it is not only a handful of crazy Jews whom I happen to know, or who happen to know me and who have turned to me, who have these concerns and who have raised these issues. These are very real concerns, legitimate feelings of life being turned upside down, life being made into something unbearable, unreasonably restricted and regulated in a manner which many people find impossible to bear. Nor can it be denied that on top of the economic and educational destruction of lockdown policies that have been implemented in many countries around the world, there is also the very real concern, which is being increasingly voiced and discussed around the world, of psychological damage to society, to people in general, particularly to children, due to some of these regulations and restrictions. Despite being very aware of these concerns, and I readily admit that I am greatly disturbed, and I would say even shocked, at some of the policies and measures that have been implemented in Israel and in many other countries for over 1 year now, and the repercussions, short-term, mid-term and long-term ramifications of these policies. Despite being very mindful of these things, I find myself forced to say that at the present time, given the current reality in Israel, I do not consider the situation to be such that it would justify leaving Eretz Yisrael. This, I think, would be a terrible conclusion to reach and a great mistake, and something very, very tragic, which must be avoided. Nor do I feel that the current state of affairs in Israel should dissuade people from coming on Aliyah, which is of course a great mitzvah. However, I must add that if vaccinations were coerced and made compulsory, were a law to be enacted in Israel, whereby policemen would appear at the door of a person who chose not to be vaccinated, they would knock on this person's door and physically hold him down against his will and inject this or that substance into his body against his will. A nightmarish scenario, in my view. Not a scenario that I think likely to materialize in Israel, but were such a situation to arise, I must state with a very heavy heart that I would definitely understand people choosing to leave Eretz Yisrael, at least for some time, to avoid such an invasion of privacy and, in fact, an invasion of one's body, because that is exactly what we are discussing. The notion that a government authority, that politicians, that anybody could force a person to be injected with any substance that a person refuses to agree to. In other words, that the person's body would be considered the property of the state and not his own personal, private property, so to speak, granted to him by Hashem. That is truly terrifying, and I would not be able to criticize people who would choose to flee from such a reality. May Hashem grant all of the Jewish people wisdom and understanding so that such a reality will never come to pass.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar Chaim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar Chaim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.